feels strange to say good afternoon when it's really very dark outside. The days are getting short. I'm not quite used to it. But welcome to the renewal and the inaugural lecture of this academic year's UU Talks lecture series. For those of you who are not familiar, the UU Talks is it's a lecture series run by students, and it's for students. So that means any of you can give a talk. Doesn't have to be your thesis topic. You don't even if you're not doing a thesis, you can still come and talk about something that's interesting to you as long as it relates to sustainability. So before I introduce myself and our speaker, I wanted to get to know you guys as an audience. How many of you are bachelor's level students? Okay, nice. Welcome. How many of you guys are masters? Okay. And dare I say PhDs? Okay, you're all clustered in one place. It's okay. So the great thing about UU Talks is that regardless of academic level, you can share ideas. This is a really cool place where, if you're wondering, how will I find somebody who's interested in the same project as me? Maybe you'll find them here at this talk. Maybe you give a talk about something and then you can connect with other people and start innovating something. Now, I guess we can proceed to introductions. My name is Valentina. I'm a master's student in the Sustainable Development Program here at Utrecht. And this is my first year, and I'm one of the coordinators for the UU Talks program. And I am a co-coordinator along with Tim, Asma, Jonas, Josep, where I don't see where he is, and of course, Adri, who is our speaker tonight. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce him to you. Adriaan van der Loos, he joined the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development in the Faculty of Geosciences as a PhD candidate. He focuses on alternative and innovative governance mechanisms with a particular focus on sustainable forestry management in Central and Eastern Europe. During his master's program at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, he went to northwestern Russia to conduct field research on forestry certification, governance, and sustainable forest management. So out of St. Petersburg, he plunged into the heart of these Russian forests to speak with forest companies. And so he's going to share that experience with us during his talk today and then open the floor for discussion later. And so, without further ado, let's bring Adri to the table. Okay, everybody give a warm hand for him. Come on. Okay, get some circulation going.
Okay, so get started here. Thanks a lot. That was fabulous, and it's really cool to do this first, let's call it inaugural UU Talk of the year. This sort of green office project is really interesting, and I like the idea of being able to present these sustainability ideas to students from a student perspective. So before I actually get into my research in Russia and what I've done and what I'm going to hopefully do in the future, I'm going to talk about transnational private regulation and certification labels. So I'm going to talk about what this concept is from a theoretical basis, its processes, and how we're working on evaluating it and measuring its effectiveness. So it might sound like a complicated political science term that some of you might not be familiar with, but that's okay. Most of you are probably familiar with its output, which are the certification labels that we see on many of the products that we consume every day. Here we go. Fairtrade, looking to increase worker wages, particularly in the coffee and chocolate sectors. The FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, for sustainable forestry management. The Rainforest Alliance, Ethical Tea Partnership. There's over 400 labels in the world, and they're growing, and there's more and more of them. They certify all sorts of different products, and a lot of times they certify the same products. But overall, the goal is to try to increase the social and environmental standards, often above and beyond what legal requirements companies have within a country. And it's also designed to be a third-party auditing system. The market is over $30 billion annually and growing. It's very difficult to estimate, but it's extraordinary, and it has a market growth rate of about 40%. If you think about today's annual growth rates, about 1.5%, 2%, 40% growth rate within a certain market is extraordinary. So, I think we can get right into it. What is transnational private regulation? So, transnational private regulation is a concept within which certification falls. So this definition, transnational private regulation, constitutes a new body of rules, practices, and processes created primarily by private actors, firms, NGOs, independent experts, like technical standard setters, and epistemic communities. In a way, it's a form of governance without government, where the rule makers are NGOs, not the government, and these rules are upheld on a voluntary basis by companies. When we say transnational, we're referring to cross-border programs that don't put the nation state at the center of focus. So, like in international, we have each nation state. Here we're just looking at the people within these nation states, these actors, without really caring what country it is. It's private, not because it's a money-making enterprise, but because it's non-state. Its NGOs are creating these rules, they're setting the standards. And regulation, well, because we're trying to govern a certain situation. So certification, these labels that we just saw, the Fairtrade, the Max Havelaar, FSC, MSC, this is all a form of transnational private regulation. All right, so I'd like to talk a little bit about how this works in theory. What are we trying to go for? What's the ultimate goal? And what's the process along this whole chain? So first, we're talking about companies. Companies want to get certified. You see when you buy your chocolate or your coffee or your wood, your printer paper, for example, maybe some fish. This comes from a company and it has a label. So how did this label end up on this package? We start with getting the company certified. Now a company, they might have a certain interest in this. They want to build a reputation. There's all sorts of different reasons why they might want to get into the certification business. So they have to establish contact with one of these NGOs. Sometimes there's multiple NGOs trying to certify the same thing. So then they have to find out, okay, well, this NGO certifies it this way, this one certifies it that way. They might have different standards, there might be different procedures, there might be different costs. So a company has to decide, well, I want the Max Havelaar, the Fairtrade certification, and not the UTZ one. Or I want the FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, and not the PEFC, the Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certificates for Sustainable Forestry Management. The company has to make that decision. They get in contact with the certification body, and then an assessment is carried out. So this assessment tries to evaluate whether the company is adhering to the standards that have been laid out by the NGO. Often this is done by a third party, so this removes a bit of the bias. The NGO actually outsources, in a sense, the regulation and the verification to a third party. Third party gets the standards, and then they measure it against actual performance on the company. So then you're trying to eliminate a bit of this market bias. Often there's a pre-assessment, so that kind of gives a company an initial sense of what's going on before they actually commit to the full assessment process. Are they close to getting this certification? Do they have a lot of work to do? Gives them a bit of a sense of what's going on. After the assessment, a company usually will have to undergo some modifications, make some changes, or they're just already doing the right things. They're sustainable, they're paying their workers right. Usually there's some modifications. The modifications can range from documentary, better documentation, okay, they have to file their paperwork a bit better, to significant behavioral changes, like paying your workers better, or stopping to chop down all these trees, improve ecological resources. Once they do that, they've now gotten certified, and they've gotten the legal right, which is protected under trademark laws, to display one of these certifications on their products. So in fact, if a company tried to display a fair trade label on their product and they weren't certified officially by Fairtrade, there could be a legal pursuit. These audits, these certifications, are usually valid for about 3 to 5 years, depends on the organization. And within this time, an interim audit, an unannounced audit, can be carried out. So it's basically a surprise inspection to make sure that the companies are actually doing the right thing and adhering to the standards they promised to adhere to. And in the case of non-compliance, a certificate is suspended, and the company can then either make some modifications, or if it's a serious violation, the certificate will actually be revoked. And then, after 3 to 5 years, there's a fixed audit, and that's a full reassessment of the company, its behavior, making sure that they're still adhering to the standards they promised to adhere to. And sometimes there's actually standard changes within an NGO. So they make their standards stricter, for example. That gets reevaluated at this 3 to 5 year period. When the company theoretically successfully passes this stage, they get recertified, and the cycle continues. Alrighty, so companies are certified, but how does it actually get to us? Now, there's two styles of certification. There's the certification for the initial producer, and then there's the certification for all the actors within the value chain. It's the importers, exporters, buyers, processors of products, the end seller, retailers, so that when it gets to you, you know that your product is still certified. So in this schema, we have the forest management, sustainable forestry management certification scheme. And in the first part here, we have forest management certification. And they're certifying the companies that are in the forest chopping the trees down. So they've been certified to do this in a sustainable way. They have to replant trees, they have to respect the local laws, the domestic laws of the country, respect indigenous populations, and then they get certified. But then after that, how do we know that the whole process to this paper here is still certified? Well, so then the companies along this chain of custody also get certified. And they've promised to adhere also to only sourcing their products from sustainable forestry management companies. And so that way, by the time the product gets to you, you know that everybody in the chain has respected these sustainable management practices and it hasn't been contaminated with unsustainable or uncertified products. All right, so now we're going to get to the question that everybody wants to ask. Does it work? And it's pretty much the first question that everybody asks me, and it's a valid question, and I try to take it with a grain of salt and get into what we're actually trying to evaluate here. So what does it work? What's it, and what does work mean? So we're talking about, the it is these programs, these certification labels. So we have to talk about a specific program, not certification in a broad sense. Does this program work? Does it work in a specific region? And then what does work mean? Well, work is basically an everyday term for effective. Are these programs effective? Now, Oren Young has defined effectiveness as the degree to which a regime eliminates or alleviates the problems that prompt its creation. It sounds nice. He goes on to say that the way we evaluate this is to try to see what would have happened in the absence of some key factor. If we hadn't implemented this regime, what would have happened in the other scenario? But you can already imagine this is pretty hard to figure out. So we're trying to extrapolate alternate universes. Okay, you have the regime with certification, the regime without the certification but the laws, or maybe even different laws, different programs. It's pretty hard to do. And so some other researchers have come up with this layout here, which has to go in order. And we're going from output to outcome to impact. Now, output is the actual standard setting, the creation of these programs. And that's the creation of the rules. So theoretically, are these rules actually sufficient to respond to the issue at hand? On paper, is that actually going to get us where we want to get if everybody does the right things? That's step number one. Because if you don't have the right rules, you're never going to get to step number 2 or step number 3. Then you need outcome. You actually need uptake. You need companies, primarily, to start listening to these rules. Start, at least on paper, checking the boxes. This is complicated for the certification programs because it's voluntary. So now we're looking at the uptake within these companies. Which ones have taken these programs? Have they adopted them or not? And have they started to check the boxes? So now you have rules, and you have companies supposedly following the rules. But do we actually get change? That's where the impact comes in. What's going on right now? Is the situation any different than it used to be? Is it the same? What's changed? How has it changed? In the case of sustainable forestry management, because I like trees, so I talk a lot about that, where if we see that they've succeeded at reducing deforestation, for example, we know we have strict rules, we have large uptake, so a lot of these companies, which represents a large portion of the market, say, they've all adhered to this, and we've reduced deforestation. Well, okay, maybe this program actually is effective. So as I said, this is quite complicated for certification. This research has also been applied to international environmental regimes, so the Montreal Protocol on CFCs, or the Kyoto Protocol, and now the Paris Agreements. All these programs are trying to measure effectiveness. Are they actually doing what they want to do? Are they succeeding at doing that? But it's, of course, very complicated. What's also cool is that there's a large research gap, and that's where I'm trying to jump in. And people who are interested in this, there's a lot of research that's been done, a lot of field research, a lot of theoretical research, but since it's evolving, it's growing, it's changing, there's a lot that we can still do, a lot we can still research. So if you're interested, I personally think it's a really interesting, really fascinating way to know what different actors, different companies, different NGOs think, what are they doing, where are they going, and how could we make this whole process a bit better. Okay, so the final slide before I get into my actual research are the limits. So I'm going to try to preempt a few of the questions that, of course, are probably already jumping out. These programs are voluntary by nature. There's no legal obligation for companies to adhere to these certification rules. They do if they want. They have different reasons. Maybe it's market pressure, maybe it's not. A lot of my research was to try to find out what non-market factors were at hand in this whole process. You have potential greenwashing. It's the idea that a company says they're being green, but in reality they're not. They've managed to check the boxes on paper, so they give themselves an eco label, for example, but they haven't really done anything different. Greenwashing. It's hard to measure the results, the impact. It's really difficult. That's a combination of ecology, political science, everything going together, millions of variables, many different countries, regions around the world, different actors. It's a challenge, and it's difficult to measure as well. Another interesting issue are spurious correlations. You have a nice program, you have some nice results, but is there a causal link there? Did this program actually create the change? And that's what the previous slide about this output-outcome impact is trying to address. So we're trying to see, okay, well, they did all the right things, and we have a change. Maybe we can actually infer some kind of causal link. The representativity of participants, both in the standard setting and participation, but also in the data collection. So, who's actually participating in the standard making? Is this, are these just big companies setting rules, for their own benefit, so they can push out the small actors? Are the small actors also being included in the process? But then also when you get data, when you go into the field, who do you talk to? Who are the easy ones to access? The big companies. If you have a big forestry company with 2,000 employees, they have an entire market, an entire department dedicated to marketing, to answering these kinds of questions. The small company, it's a mom and pop shop, Chump and Stump, for example, and it's more difficult to talk to them. They're spread out. They don't necessarily have the resources to dedicate to you, some random foreigner going and asking them questions. So it's quite difficult to get a proper representativity of the participants. And that also means that the data is difficult to access. All right. Yeah.
Do you mind if I interrupt you? Do you want me to leave it to the end?
Is it sort of about that specifically?
Yeah, it's about the last slide.
Sure.
Do you think that the cost of certification is a limit?
Yes.
Because I remember, I know this is a government certification, but like USDA organic is really expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of organic farms don't get certified because of that. They're too small, I guess.
Mm-hmm. It's absolutely an issue, and it's one I was confronted with when I was doing my research. A lot of these programs are very expensive to get audited, to get certified. So a company has to essentially pay the fees to go through this whole process, and for a small company, that can be rather difficult. Some NGOs have tried to, now that they're well underway, they've tried to respond to this criticism by developing like group certifications. So it's sort of a region, a bunch of companies get together and they sort of get certified under the same umbrella. There's some small stakeholder pilot projects going on. It is a big issue, and as these programs evolve, NGOs are trying to respond to this, but it absolutely is a limit to this whole process. Thanks. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my research in Russia, and then go into what I want to talk about in the future. So Russia, big country up there, has 20% of the world's forests. So you can imagine this is a pretty significant region to research. They have a large forestry industry. Currently, they're not witnessing any deforestation on a countrywide scale, although there is very serious localized deforestation in certain regions. Certification uptake is growing at an extraordinary rate, although it's still relatively small. Only 42 million hectares are certified, which sounds enormous. It's probably quite a few times bigger than the Netherlands, but that's still only 9% of all the forests in Russia. However, about 25% of the wood that's actually harvested is certified, although that's also a difficult estimate because then you're changing your measurements. Right now, there's 192 forest management certificates. Those are the companies in the forest actually chopping the trees down, and over 600 chain of custody certificates. Those are the pulp and paper mills, the importers, the exporters, the processors, and the retailers. So, this was my research in Russia. As Valentina mentioned, I was based out of St. Petersburg, and I went up into northwest Russia. St. Petersburg is already in northwest Russia, on sort of the southernmost western part of northwest Russia, and I went off and interviewed some companies in a few different regions. It was really cool, really cold, I really liked the experience, and my goal was to try to find out what these companies thought about this whole certification thing. It's a Western-driven governance mechanism. It comes from, it's driven by the OECD countries. In fact, the FSC, the certification label, was founded in Canada, 1993, following the Rio Conference on Biodiversity, and the failure to enact international forestry regulations. So this kind of popped out of that. It comes from Canada. The main office is in Bonn, Germany. And so you can imagine that other countries are a bit skeptical of these sort of Western-imposed governance mechanisms. They think they're doing just a fine job. So my goal was to go into the forest and talk to them and actually see what's affecting the adoption and diffusion, that is, the uptake of these programs. And so I talked to small, medium, and large forestry companies, and certainly there was a vast array of differences in what they thought, what was encouraging or hindering their uptake. And especially for small companies, one of the issues that came up was the cost, both monetary and time cost. They didn't have the bureaucratic resources to print out the right documentation, fill out the right forms, but there was also the monetary cost. There were other issues like this idea that, oh gosh, my sovereignty as an independent company is being infringed upon. the larger companies, these sort of multinational, multi-stakeholder, joint state companies, they kind of saw a broader picture. And so that's what they were able to take a bit of a proactive approach. So that research was really focused on the perception that these harvesting companies held towards certification. And now my research, what I'm hoping to do here in Utrecht at the Copernicus Institute, it's still just getting underway, is to not just look at the Russian scenario or just the forest harvesters, but also the entire value chain, all of the actors within this process, the pulp and paper mills, the importers, the exporters, the retailers, and also in the entire Eastern European region. So I'm also interested in looking at Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, some of whom have integrated into the European Union, some who have closer trade links and ties to Russia. So that's kind of where I'm hoping to go from here. And I think at that, I'd like to leave it at that, with sort of this broad idea of what I want to do, what I want to find out. I want to see how some non-market factors are affecting certification uptake in these countries, everything ranging from democratic freedom, political freedom, economic freedom, corruption, also looking at what strategies these NGOs are implementing in different countries. So what is the NGO behavior? What are the partnerships between the government, the companies, and also the NGOs? And then ultimately, what is the perception that all these different actors have? And so I'd like to see how these different factors also affect certification uptake, which is quite varied. But you think it should be similar if you have similar market factors, which is intuitive. But in fact, that's not really the case. So my theory is that there's something else going on behind the scenes. And that's what I'd like to find out over the next 4 years. So thank you very much. And I think now we'll have some questions, and then also we can sort of open it up into a bit of a discussion as well. Thank you.
So I would, okay, I'm going to grab a seat. That was a great talk. So we'll start with your question, and then let's get the ball rolling.
Yeah, it's just, I sort of have two. The first one's just like a fact that I don't know. How do these NGOs make money? You kind of shed a light on it, I guess, for me with the certification, but is there any other way that they get, like what do these labels earn from doing this? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. Not just the benefit of the environment, but how do they actually benefit from it? Like, monetary-wise.
Okay, yeah, so it's a good question. They are NGOs, they're nonprofit, yeah. So they aren't designed to make money. Okay. They do need to sustain themselves. Yeah, that's what I'm and the majority of that does come from the certification procedure. So the companies pay fees. Okay. The initial assessment, and then the auditing fees as well, and then the reassessment. So the vast majority does come from these fees, which is also a bit of an issue because the organizations need the companies to participate, but then if they make the rules too strict, then nobody's going to participate, and then nobody's going to pay the fees to keep the organization going. So you do have a bit of a cycle here. And as these organizations get a bit more developed, they're able to impose themselves a bit more on the global scene. But most of the fees do come from the certification process.
Okay, and the second question, this may also be just me being naive, but I feel like when you said one of the limitations was untangible results, like can't you kind of get results from like consumer sales? Like before we didn't have the label, now we have the label. And also just interviewing people and asking them like, would you pay this for something? Would you prefer this label? Like, do you even know what this is? Like the label means? Things like that. Like aren't these clear ways to like see if it's working?
Yeah, also a great question. So unclear tangible results. So it's clear that a lot of people are buying these products. There's no question. It's a market. People buy, Fairtrade coffee. That's a clear result. What I'm talking about when I say unclear tangible results is really the impact with these programs. Are they actually doing what they say they are doing? So not whether people are buying them, but people are clearly buying Fairtrade, for example, but are small-time coffee growers, are they actually getting paid more for their products? And then if they are, is that just a short-term difference, or is it a long-term difference? It's a bit more difficult to measure. Fair trade is one of the easier ones to measure because you can just find out if a company's actually paying them better. Other ones like sustainable forestry management, okay, you can kind of measure deforestation, but there's a lot of forests in the world. You have satellite data. You can pick out a company that's doing something illegally, but it's quite difficult. And then also, if you're trying to measure the conservation of high conservation value forests, where are those? What are those? It takes quite a large technical expertise as well. So the tangible results, it's not always clear whether it works. Certainly there's a lot of studies, and there needs to be even more. For example, there's been some studies on fair trade in Mexico that did show that in Mexico the coffee growers were getting paid better, but then in other countries it didn't change much, or it was actually limiting the growers because then they were fixed into a certain price scheme and they weren't able to compete on the market as price fluctuations changed. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So shouldn't there be, is there or shouldn't there be an entity that actually evaluates what are the good labels? Because as you said, there are so many around, and NGOs, they provide them themselves. So as there are as many NGOs, there will be as many labels then.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't we need something like a higher level of certification of the certificates? Kind of like maybe the European Union should do that. Like then we will also be more informed as consumers, as there's too many fair trade labels at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps less for forestry management, we're still a few. So is there something going that direction? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. There is what's called the ISEAL. It's an alliance of some of the quote-unquote best labels. So Fairtrade is a member, the FSC is a member, but for example the PEFC, sort of the FSC competitor, is not a member. And this is exactly, it's a certifier of certifiers. And they're trying to do that.
Is there a reliable source?
They operate in the same way as the certifiers, the certification organizations work. So they have their own set of standards, and then each of these NGOs adheres to these standards, and they submit themselves to transparency requirements and regular auditing. So yeah, it is. That's how they've tried to respond to this issue, for sure. I think one of the biggest problems also is at the consumer level. We don't know who belongs to what. Okay, I happen to know because I research it, but how does somebody, and I only know about a couple of them, but there's more than 400 labels. I don't know what all of them do, or which one is considered the good one, the bad one, the company initiated one. A lot of these labels are industry driven, so the labels are a bit more lenient. You can get certified easier, but how do you know? And that's really one of the biggest issues for the end consumer. You can go into more detail. You can go to the ISEAL website, ISEAL. I think it's iseal.org, if I'm not mistaken. And then they have, I think there's maybe 20 labels that they've certified themselves as being the quote-unquote good labels.
I wanted to interject. Is anybody conducting research related to this topic? Do they have any information that they want to share? And to weigh in on this?
Yeah, please contribute.
Also, I wanted to ask, could you two introduce yourselves? Sorry?
Yep, you were still going.
No, yeah.
My name is Jessica. I'm studying climate physics here at Utrecht. I'm from Canada.
Yeah, I'm Camilla. I'm doing a PhD in biochemistry here in Utrecht.
I see. So I understand. So you guys are coming from like the very hard sciences. You want to see like true measures of effectiveness and whatnot.
Mm.
Yeah. I was talking to Adri earlier about this. I was saying like there's so many different independent companies that are doing certification. How can we trust them? How is there going to be incentive if only 10% of businesses are doing certification now? How are we going to convince the other 90% to go about it? Is the government going to take over at some point? Is this just an intermediate step? And Adri had some interesting thoughts about that.
And there's also, from what I've seen anyway, I don't know I've never thought too much about So I'm definitely not one of those people who's investigated the labels. But one thing I have noticed is even companies that you know aren't so good slap their own label on it, and it's nothing like those. But for example, Nestle has like this cocoa plant label, which means nothing outside of Nestle. But to a consumer who knows nothing, I'm like, oh look, they're doing something so nice. I don't know what it means. It's just
it's the greenwashing phenomenon.
Yeah, and we have like just so many, like it's so easy to almost copy a label in a sense that you make it look enough like, you know, like the actual, I think the general consumer is not investigating these labels, and until one gets really well known, or maybe like this iSeal thing will push it forward, but until it gets like very well known, I think any label on there is gonna make us believe make the general consumer believe it's a good product.
And I think especially in this generation nowadays, like there's a huge trend towards virtue signaling. So companies like Nestle can take advantage of things like this, where you know you have a label on your bottle. It doesn't mean anything, but people will think you're a good person. So it's an easy wave to ride.
Does anybody else have any thoughts on?
I have a question. Yeah, you talked about corruption, and I was wondering. I'm Tim. I study economic policy from Germany. You talked about corruption, and I was wondering, like, if we talk about some little businesses in Russia, like, how do you have any number in mind what could be a rate of fraud? I don't know, that companies set up subsidiary companies and they buy the wood and they get the certificate, but then the other company is not sustainable, or, I mean, it seems like really complicated to, if I don't know, if like some expert comes from Europe or from the US and then he goes to Russia and he goes into this business, and I mean, they're obviously experts, but it might be still really difficult to see through all what's happening, right? I mean.
So there hasn't been too much evidence of abuse of the labels themselves. Within Russia, they have their own office, their own FSC office, for example. It's based out of Moscow, and then they have some subsidiary offices in the Far East. So there hasn't been too much evidence of label copying. Most of the sustainable forestry issues in Russia have to do with just company behavior, and that's a bit outside of that's what the FSC is trying to respond to and confront by pressuring companies to undergo an external auditing system. In many of these countries, most countries around the world, there's very strict laws on sustainable forestry management. But the question is, are the companies actually listening to the laws? And that's where you get a lot of the issues. You get decimation of forests, especially high conservation value forests, ecosystems, biodiversity, pushing out indigenous and local populations. And so these programs are trying to bring in external reviewers, in a sense, because the government is clearly not able to do it itself. In fact, certain government officials might even be part of the problem, and quite often they are. But it doesn't seem like there's too much of an issue with an abuse of the labels themselves, because there is fairly regular auditing, and then the companies, when they submit to this, to getting audited, they know that it could be taken away, and they do get taken away. And as these labels get stronger and stronger, like the FSC, for example, they have more and more power to take labels away. Maybe at the very beginning, if you have only 5 companies, and you take away a label, well, that's like 20% of the people who are doing this. But now, across the world, there's hundreds of millions of hectares certified. So it's easier for them to say, no, you're not doing the right thing. I'm going to revoke your certificate.
So over time, you build authority and momentum.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Other companies to start participating as well, because they see that they can also stand to gain something from it, more authority.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, when you were conducting your research, you were going through you were examining the entire chain?
No. So for my research, what I did, it was just looking at the forest harvesters, the ones who receive this initial forest management certificate, and not the value chain itself. But my future research the idea is to incorporate all of these actors.
Where do you foresee the strongest bottleneck in the certification process throughout this chain?
Bottleneck of what?
Just bottleneck of transparency of information, willingness to cooperate, that sort of thing.
resources to cooperate?
Yeah, I think it's fairly evenly distributed, but certainly when you have smaller companies, then you get bottlenecks. The big ones that are pretty integrated into the global chain, that doesn't seem to be too much of an issue. A lot of it also has to do with where your products are going. That also can be a bit of an issue.
Like how?
So whether your market is, say, Europe or China, you might get some differences between the certification. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Peter from Germany, studying sustainable development. You know me.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I forgot to ask.
No worries. No. You don't know me.
Okay.
I think.
You're also a coordinator, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's good. No, but I was wondering, what do you think is the biggest weakness of these labels? Like, in general, like, what is the biggest thing they have to address to actually become more effective? For instance, like the biggest thing, I guess, because there's a number of different aspects that you mentioned.
Yeah. The biggest weakness. I think it goes back to this idea of consumer knowledge. That's just my opinion. It's really difficult to know exactly which limit is the biggest problem, but a consumer who sees a nice label, that's probably sufficient, even if it means nothing. So consumer knowledge, but then also companies play on this. They create their labels because they know that a consumer doesn't necessarily know. And so how do we increase the knowledge of consumers so that they know to buy the right certified product versus the wrong certified product? It's a challenge, yeah.
And do you think that maybe that, I'm not sure if this exists, but that the government should actually step in to ensure that, like, you're only able to put a label on there if it's actually, like, government working with proper kind of certification groups, let's say, that, you have to have a certain, of course, might be counterproductive, but then again, how do you counteract these fake labels, the bandwagon people?
Yeah, that's great. So the whole point is that it's a bit non-governmental, that it stays out of the government realm. There have been cases where a certification has received so much uptake by companies that at some point the government actually made a law which was based on the certification rules to push the last 25% into behaving better. This was a case of transparency, social transparency in companies in England. And now the multinationals in England, the big companies, have to actually publish the social benefits and not just the economic, their economic plan. So that was due to these certification transparency initiative. And when there was enough uptake, the government said, okay, we're going to make it a law now. Now everybody has to do it. Oops. And then that brought the last 25% up. Another way, without the government directly intervening from a legal perspective, is that the government can really encourage one label over another one. And that has happened. So that's government procurement. Really important for the wood industry, because governments build buildings, they can use a lot of paper, as we know. Maybe not so much for coffee, although the Dutch government probably buys a lot of coffee. So the government procurement can be a really good way to promote one label over another. So, for example, the MSC, the Marine Stewardship Council, in Norway, first the government was really reticent to letting these NGOs get into this. And at some point they realized that, hey, that was actually good. It was good for our image as a Norwegian, as a country, as a major fish exporter. And so they really promoted the MSC over Oceanwise, for example. So there are ways for the government to really push one label over another one. Yeah.
Is the European Union also doing something like that? For example, they have the European Union label for organic products. Can they extend it towards Fairtrade and forestry management?
Mm-hmm. So the organic, they lay out a set of guidelines, but they don't actually do the certification themselves.
But there is a EU label for organic products.
Yeah. So it's because it's EU regulated, just EU determined. And what they have done is they've, for wood, for example, there are guidelines, in that companies within the EU now have to prove that they've done due diligence on sourcing their wood from non-illegally harvested sources. not necessarily sustainable, certified sustainable, but at least not illegal. And they've recognized that some labels are count as due diligence, for example. So, say a company buys some wood, it counts as due diligence if they buy certified wood. That's due diligence is the sense that they've done their homework before they bought the product. And so a company can say, oh, I bought FSC certified wood, I've done my homework, I know that this wood is happy wood.
We have an addition from Leonie.
Yeah.
Well, you already said most things what I wanted to say, but well, I did an internship in actually this area, and so well, no, I'm new. I'm doing a master in sustainable development. I'm also from Germany. And for example, in Germany, we have a governmental initiative that elaborates that it's called the Sustainable Standards Comparison Tool. I don't know if you've heard of it. And they compare and rank different standards, and also want to inform the public. So there are initiatives that especially doing this.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, thank you.
They're also collaborating with the ICO Alliance. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we had a question in the corner over there.
Lithuania, political science. So I'm interested, we recently had Paris Agreement, and I just want to ask, was there any kind of points maybe you did, when you did research, you like run into of any discussion about like, well, some kind of actions under labeling? Was there any talks, well, any changes of how like should universal kind of organizations, all countries on themselves contribute more to like, well, making labeling more efficient as we talk now?
No, I haven't heard anything about labeling being integrated into the Paris process. I think it could be, but no, I haven't heard too much about that, especially since it was directly associated with carbon reduction. Maybe you could get into sustainable forestry management because that has to do with carbon sinks and sort of mitigating climate change, but a fair trade label which pays to pay workers better, not directly related to climate. So I think, as far as I know, this the labeling discussion was more or less left out of the Paris agreements. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I heard that people that looked into fair trade labels came up with quite a few critiques against how actually these fair trade labels is benefiting people in developing countries or not, actually mostly not, and that's why, for example, Tony Ciacololi decided to do this whole initiative to actually bring to the market a chocolate that is almost 100% slavery free. So they kind of created their own label, and in this way they kind of pushed the market of cacao producers to do better. So they want to be kind of a trendsetter, not just to say we don't just want the fair trade label because we know that's not enough. We have done studies to show that actually laborers are not earning better. Most of the places in Africa where they produce chocolate. So we want to do better. We want to push the market to do better, and we create this very working brand, and so they are doing it. Do you, so you said the other side of forestry labeling, do you see a similar criticism that perhaps could be more effective with labeling, and do you see a possibility of improvement within the certification, or do you see a parallelism or not?
Well, there's definitely a parallel. I think one of the biggest issues is uptake. It's still a pretty small market as a percentage of the global market in terms of certified wood. I think so. Uptake is definitely an issue. And what these labels have done is they've tried to shed light on some rather shady industries. And I think that was the first big step, is that consumers started to realize, wait, we want something better, and nobody really knows how to get it there, so we're going to try this labeling program, these labeling systems. And that's the first step. I definitely don't think it's a be-all, end-all. I do personally think that there are some benefits around the world, depending on where you are, what you're trying to certify, what they're doing. One of the biggest issues, benefits though, is that you're gaining knowledge. You're building awareness, and like in the fair trade thing, Fairtrade kind of made the splash, and that's great, but it wasn't enough. And then companies went farther, and that's amazing. That's what we need to see. I think so. For forestry management, the standards are quite strict. So now you have to get the companies. You have to get the bad companies to tag along, and that's one of the biggest challenges. Yeah. Sure, Tim. Yeah. Peter. Sorry.
Yes.
I was looking at. Yeah, also German. Yeah.
But I was wondering about the operationalization of how they do the audits. So basically, you have a certain set of standards, but obviously the NGO itself updates that every so often.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, you can't do an audit like all the time. So you have, let's say, a company that gets kind of pre-certified, so they're in the process,
Mm-hmm.
and then after 5 years they get audited. So what's the standard by which the final audit is done if the NGO's standards have changed in the meantime between the company applying for it and then being audited for it? Because obviously, like, they first have to get from A to B,
Mm-hmm.
but the NGO might be at C already. So do they then obviously test for B, or do they even, tell them to update their own standards, the company, as they're already trying to implement them?
Yeah, so you're talking about like modification of standards along the way.
Yeah.
So like all of a sudden a program gets a lot stricter.
Yeah.
So, well, of course, when you get certified, you're getting certified to the most up-to-date standards, right? And
well, that's the problem, right? I would say, like, because maybe the standards get much stricter in like a short period of time, or
so they don't really get too much stricter because actually the PFC has gotten quite stricter because they realized that they were losing market to the FSC. They were losing reputation, so they've actually improved their standards. And yeah, if the standard setting process has changed and your company doesn't meet the standards, there's probably some leeway in terms of, okay, now we're going to give you a year or 2 years to adapt to the new standards or whatever.
That would seem to me like a big obstacle, especially for perhaps smaller companies. But even like, because if you move the goalposts, basically, then like it's worst case scenario, like you just finished getting your whole stuff up to date, up to the standards that they wanted, and right before the audit, and they come and say, well, actually, we've changed it in the meantime. So now you have to change it again. And then worst case scenario, you always end up running after the certification, but never getting it because you're not able to do it perhaps that fast, let's say. Because they keep
so your audit will still be valid for the 3 to 5 years, and then the interim audits will still be measured against the initial standards that you went. So at most you would have to change your behavior every 3 to 5 years.
Right.
They don't change too much. And also in this whole standard setting process, depending on the organization, there's more or less industry involvement. In any case, the industry is well informed while the standard setting process is going on, and usually they're actually participants. So for the FSC, for example, there's the social standard setters, the environmental standard setters, and then the industry. And it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So usually the social and environmental people have a little coalition, and so that keeps the industry a bit weaker, which that's kind of the point also. But they are kept up to date, and it could be a risk. I mean, that if you're going to all of a sudden increase your standards quite a lot, more than just some extra paperwork or more than just some small modifications, it's a risk. It's a risk that you're going to lose, let's call them clients. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
This is kind of a shot in the dark, but have you researched at all how there's a massive paper lobby or paper private interest here in Europe?
Mm-hmm.
Did you at all study their involvement in certification? Like, are they? I mean, if they can charge more for FSC certified paper, they probably see it as a plus, no?
Certainly. So there's been a lot of research on that. The paper lobby is quite big. In Europe, they are fairly proactive about sustainable forestry management. They're all about it. They want to source their wood from legally. They have to often, regardless of the certification part. EU laws or laws within countries in the EU are quite strict. Europe has a pretty good rate of paper recycling. So the European industry is fairly well established in the sustainability, as sustainable as it could be in a sense, in terms of where the wood comes from. The processing is a bit different.
So you did your research in Russia, which is a country that is not the first thing that comes to mind when you think of transparency. What were some obstacles that you faced in gathering information?
That goes back to the data accessibility limit. I called maybe 200 companies to get a handful of interviews. Some numbers didn't exist anymore. They kept the market's really changing and evolving super rapidly in Russia. They've gone through a lot of different reforms since the breakup of the Soviet Union. The industry was privatized, then it's been decentralized, re-centralized, decentralized. Big companies are eating up little companies. They're breaking up. And so you have quite a large fragmentation of the industry. And that was really an issue as I was trying to, and my Russian is not super great either, so I can get by. But yeah, it's calling these companies. Some companies actually hung up on me when I mentioned the word regulation. I was like, hey, I'm a student from Canada, whatever, doing this research. I was wondering what you thought about. I was wondering if I could come visit you and talk to you about regulation. And like, okay, goodbye. And
maybe it sounded like Jehovah's Witness or something. Can I talk to you about our Savior?
Yeah, they were like, wah!
Are you saved? Yeah. Has anybody else worked in information? I don't want to say poor, but information unpredictable environments. No. I guess we all have that coming ahead of us for our theses. You still have time.
So the real Tim.
Well, first, I think maybe the same could happen if you do the same in Canada or the US, maybe, right? I mean, some companies might be very reluctant about engaging in this topic because they know they don't do everything right, or it's maybe not just about Russia.
Yeah.
And then the question what I want to ask is, well, you talked about competition, and we talked also about that it's really difficult to know what certificates really stand for, and that a lot of consumers are confused. So I was wondering, do you think competition can be a chance to get rid of the bad labels and keep the good ones, or what are the factors of the competition? Like how come that some companies grow, some organizations grow, and others lose clients? I mean, is it about their efficiency, or is it about consumers actually that do understand which one is the good one, which one is the bad one?
Neither, actually. And there's been a few studies, and that's, in fact, kind of to the contrary. Some of the worse labels are doing better. It's a bit normative to say better or worse with these kinds of things, but the ones who have been less well evaluated, let's put it that way, because they're more industry-driven, so they get more uptake by the big companies, because a company like Nestle says, oh, look, I'm certified, and so they put their weight behind this label. It is officially third-party audited, but they were pretty much the standard setter. So they got to make the rules. And then you have Nestle behind the certification and not some small companies. And there was quite a big study, one of the initial studies, field research studies on forestry certification, and it was measuring the legitimacy of the FSC versus the PEFC, in fact, and in 5 OECD countries. And it was it made quite a splash, and it was trying to understand why the FSC, what the FSC was doing to confront this new rising PEFC power. And now the PEFC actually has more certification measured in hectares than the FSC does, even though the FSC is considered the standard bearer, the one that's ICL certified, and like WWF supported as well. So yeah, the competition is fierce. Yeah.
And maybe not good.
And it sometimes can lead to a weakening of standards. It could also lead to a strengthening of standards, especially when governments get behind procurement. So the government says, okay, well, for all our buildings that the government funds, we're only going to buy FSC certified wood. And in some countries, that can be up to like 30% of wood procurement, for example. So that can be really a good way to encourage one label over another.
Isn't that seen as unfair competition? Can they explicitly say that we only want FSC, or do they have to first make a bunch of standards and then see which certification matches up with that?
No, I mean, they can just do it. It's not really competition because they're not picking companies. Because they're picking companies that have been certified. They're just saying, we want any company that has done this because... And then they've created some standards themselves or some guidelines, what they want. And then they say, okay, well, this is the only one that actually does what we want. And so that's their justification. But I don't think they're confronted with sort of competition challenges, sort of antitrust issues, yeah.
So this brings us to our hour. And I was going to ask Adriaan one more thing, since we're all, budding or current researchers. What are some what are some words of wisdom that you'd like to pass on to us that you wish you knew when you started your research?
I wish I still knew.
Post-normal.
Yeah. Words of wisdom? No, I don't know.
Or just words of non-idiocy.
When I started this...
And then it'll get the uptake and more.
Yeah. When I started this, and I think it's quite normal, is you have a very big idea. I want to do certification. I want to do sustainable forestry. At first I wanted to do Russia, Canada, everything about certification for a master's thesis. Okay, and then you get pretty much yelled at by your professors. They're like, this is never going to happen. Come on, be realistic. You're not a research team of 10 people trying to, with a €5 million budget. So you're a little master's student.
Oh, that would be about €5 million budget.
It'd be nice, right? But no, so it's normal to start big, and it's normal that it's completely unfeasible. But that's one of the biggest challenges is understanding what it takes to do the research and whether you can carry that out as a bachelor's or master's or even PhD student. Because I have these same issues. I'm trying to do research, and I have to prove to potential funders that I can actually do it, that my research is feasible. So find something you like, really something that you think you can commit to. Even a master's thesis, it's if you're doing research where you have to go into the field or do a lot of data mining, it's labor intensive, and you got to like what you're doing. Labor intensive. Also,
I was like, oh, okay.
maybe some flavor, taste of tears, and borscht in my case. So do what you like, I guess, and find something that, at least as a broad topic, you think is really cool, is really interesting, and then just try to hone it from there. Just really focus on. I think my actual project layout changed, 10, 15 times before I got to Northwest Russia, perception, only the harvesting companies, just, certification labels, yeah. It took quite some time to narrow it down, but you have to start big, because you have to have a broad idea also of what's going on, and just be patient, and email your professors multiple times if they don't answer. Don't be afraid.
Persistence.
Yeah, absolutely.
So before I wrap it up, I wanted to say again, UU Talks, it can be a format such as what Adri did today, where he's giving a lecture and then we're participating afterwards. But future events can be something like a debate between people from two different worldviews in the same department, or maybe a student who's politically active and debating another one. It can you can do a song and dance if you want to, as long as it relates to sustainability. You don't have to be a student in sustainability to give a UU talk. So I think that's the important thing. This is a place to share ideas and to meet other like-minded individuals who want to, take action. So let's give Adri a hand. Thank you so much.
Thank you.